Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the Lucky Shots podcast. I am Ricky Larson. Got the fantasy show for you again today. Let's get this kind of situated. I didn't really check out what my camera looks like before we started, but there we go. So, fantasy show today. If you're having a season like me where you're in 3 leagues, and you have 1 win to show for all 3 leagues, you're sitting at 1-8. It's going to be kind of tough to stay excited for fantasy football and kind of keep yourself interested. But guess what? Fantasy football, it's a marathon. You gotta just buckle in for the ride. It's going to be ups and downs. You're going to have hard times. Is what it is. You got to keep fighting. Keep making headway, make some moves, work yourself back into it. I started a season 0-4 a few years ago, came back, made the playoffs, made the league championship actually, and stayed vigilant on the waiver wire, looking for those guys to pick up. Made some trades. Had to trade away guys that I thought were my stars, but they weren't doing much for me, so I got value out of them. You got to just find ways to keep it going, keep your season going, and get yourself back into the mix. For instance, just this morning, had to make what I think is a blockbuster trade. Had to go in, trade my number 1 pick from this season, Jamar Chase. Did I want to trade Jamar Chase? Not really. But did I need to? Kind of. So I traded away Jamar Chase, Chris Godwin, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Clyde has been a consistent running back for this season. Hate to have to lose him. Jamar Chase has that possibility of having 30-point games like he did in week 1. But had to get rid of those guys. I got Chris Olave, Devontae Smith, and DeAndre Swift in return. Olave has a lot of potential. Devontae Smith has a lot of potential. DeAndre Swift won't be in for 3 weeks because he's probably going to be out these 2 weeks and then have his bye week. But just like that, you got to find value, find ways to build your team, get rid of one position to help benefit other positions, make yourself competitive. That's my rant for the start of this episode. Let's hop in to the fantasy show. We got injuries to start out. This week we had Joe Mixon go down with an ankle injury. Doesn't seem serious. He's probable to play. Michael Thomas, we knew, how long is it going to be before he is on the injury report? Well, it's week 3, so he's there. It's a toe injury. Don't know how serious it is. Again, with these injuries, monitor them throughout the week. See what happens. Amon-Ra St. Brown, ankle injury. Hopefully that's not serious or severe, but ankle injuries can be tough for wide receivers. We saw he played through it last week, so it shouldn't be that bad. Should be able to rehab it. But again, keep it monitored. Then you had DeAndre Swift, as I mentioned earlier, a shoulder and ankle injury. They're thinking about keeping him out for the next 2 weeks. Then they've got their bye week, so essentially giving him 3 weeks to get healthy and then put him back in. Sorry, need to respond to set up the Lucky Bets podcast. Probably 10. There we go. Dalvin Cook went out with a shoulder injury last week. We know Dalvin Cook. We know his shoulders aren't very durable. He has problems with those. Expect him to be out maybe 2 to 3 weeks. So Alexander Mattison is probably somebody that if you drafted Dalvin, you should have drafted him as well to handcuff. And he'll be plenty fine to start in place of Dalvin Cook. And then David Montgomery, ankle injury, knee injury, probably going to be out a few weeks. It's not for certain that he's not going to play this week and play through it. but there's the probability he won't. Few weeks, I'd imagine, for David Montgomery. So if Khalil Herbert is available, go grab him. He scored 30 points in Montgomery's absence. If you have Montgomery, somebody else has Herbert, go try to make some sort of trade for him. Don't sell your team for the backup, but you might need to make the move if you don't have somebody to replace David Montgomery. So sacrifices may need to be made, but that's this week's injury report. So again, keep that monitored as you go throughout the week. All right, so let's hop into the heroes, the villains, and the good Samaritans for this past week. At the quarterback position, you had your heroes of Lamar Jackson and Jalen Hurts. Jackson had 218 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, and an interception, 107 yards on the ground with a rushing touchdown for 39.42 fantasy points. This is now back-to-back weeks. He is the quarterback one. He's killing it for your fantasy teams, and heck of a performance for him. Jalen Hurts had 340 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, I think they were passing touchdowns, and 20 rushing yards for 27.6 fantasy points. And this is his third straight top 5 finish, so he's definitely paying off wherever you got him in the draft. Your quarterback villains, Matt Stafford, Tua Tagovailoa. Stafford had 249 pass yards, 2 rushing yards, no touchdowns, nothing like that, 10.16 fantasy points. Cooper Kupp had a touchdown. It was a rushing touchdown, so it didn't even help Matt Stafford. As a Matt Stafford owner, definitely getting tired of it, thinking about making some changes. Then Tua Tagovailoa, after having that huge game, had a dud game. 186 passing yards and a touchdown. That was it. 11.44 fantasy points. Possibly got a concussion during the game. Still played, so maybe it wasn't a concussion. They said, it was something to do with his back, but that's under investigation now. So who knows whether or not he had a concussion, whether or not that played a factor. But regardless, if you had him in and you were hoping for maybe a 30-point game, you were bummed with 11.4. Then at the quarterback position, only one here, but Trevor Lawrence is a good Samaritan for being in your lineup, not expecting much, and going out and getting 25.18 fantasy points for the quarterback 4 finish. So great for him there. The running back position, your heroes are Khalil Herbert, as we mentioned, and Derrick Henry. Herbert had 157 rush yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 catches for 12 yards, giving him 30.9 fantasy points. If Montgomery is out, I think you can still expect this from Herbert. We saw it last year when Montgomery went down. Herbert was plenty fine plugging in place of him. Honestly, doing better than Montgomery had done. And then Derrick Henry, finally King Henry, has himself a game. He had 85 rush yards with a touchdown and 5 catches for 58 yards. Not something you normally see from Derrick Henry getting involved in the passing game, but he did. Got 25.3 fantasy points. Your running back villains, Miles Sanders and Aaron Jones. Miles Sanders had 46 rush yards, 1 reception, -2 receiving yards for only 5.4 fantasy points in an offense like the Eagles. You really hope for more than that. You expect in an Eagles offense that's clicking, the running back's also going to be doing it. He was not. Only 5.4 fantasy points. And then Aaron Jones, where'd you go? He had a huge week, just like Tua Tagovailoa last week. Dud this week. 36 rush yards, 3 catches for 11 yards. Only had 5.7 fantasy points. It's still hairy in that backfield, whether or not it's going to be A.J. Dillon, whether or not it's going to be Aaron Jones. Jones is obviously the better back, but He didn't show it this week, and you were definitely hoping for more than 5.7 points. So that's tough there. Good Samaritans. Let's start with Jamal Williams. How about going out there, getting 24.7 fantasy points, and finishing as the running back 3? Big time game. It's not the first time he's had a big game, even with DeAndre Swift in. Now DeAndre Swift probably going to be out for 3 weeks. Jamal Williams, you're hoping, can continue to be a good Samaritan for your lineup and give you those top 5 finishes. And then how about Devin Singletary being the running back 4? He got 24.1 fantasy points. And then Ramondre Stevenson in a New England offense that is mediocre. He shined with a running back 8 performance, got 28.1 fantasy points. At the wide receiver position, Devontae Smith and Mac Hollins. Who the hell's Mac Hollins? Right? I mean, who knows? Devontae Smith had 8 catches on 12 targets, 169 yards, and a touchdown for 30.9 fantasy points to go along with Jalen Hurts, quarterback 2 finish. And then Mac Hollins, the receiver that's essentially in place of Hunter Renfrow for the Raiders, had 8 catches on 10 targets for 158 yards and a touchdown, giving you 29.96 fantasy points. If you played him this week, if you got the wild hair up your ass to go play him this week, congratulations, because he paid off. And if you look at week 2 as well, he also had 8 targets there. So possibly something that could continue to stick, especially if Hunter Renfrow continues to be mediocre like he was in week 2 when he fumbled twice and cost them the game. So Mac Hollins, somebody that maybe you keep your eye on, especially if you're thin at the wide receiver position. Your wide receiver villains, Justin Jefferson, sat with 3 catches on 6 targets for 14 yards, only 4.4 fantasy points. Definitely not what you expect out of either the wide receiver 1 or 2 drafted in the fantasy drafts this year. Really, really hoping for him to hop back up into the top 5 where he normally should be, but it was an off week. Maybe hops back on it this week. Tyreek Hill coming off of his top 3 fantasy week, only had 2 catches on 4 targets for 33 yards, 5.3 fantasy points. That's more understandable. He went against a really good defense, so hopefully that's not something that sticks. Hopefully he continues to be a 10 to 11 target guy for Tua. Then your good Samaritans, you have quite a few here. You got Russell Gage. How about him stepping up in place of all of the Tampa Bay wide receivers being out? With a wide receiver 4 performance, 24.7 fantasy points. Big week for him. Then right underneath him, the wide receiver 5 was Zay Jones for a Jacksonville offense that apparently is good. Interestingly enough, the Jacksonville Jaguars, sitting 2-1, are a pretty good offense this year. How about Romeo Doubs? He was wide receiver 9, had 21.3 fantasy points, and of course, if you don't know who Romeo Doubs is, he's one of the many young receivers that Aaron Rodgers has to throw to over in Green Bay. Possibly he could continue to see this workload after having a great game in building a repertoire, building some trust with Aaron Rodgers, who doesn't have anybody to trust right now. So he's somebody you can continue to look out for and mark down to get on your roster and see what happens. At the tight end position, no shocker yet. Mark Andrews, 8 catches, 13 targets, 89 yards, 2 touchdowns for 28.9 fantasy points. You can just continue to expect the same out of him every single week. And then how about David Njoku? 9 catches on 10 targets for 89 yards and a touchdown, giving him 23.9. Can we come to expect this for weeks to come? Maybe at least while Jacoby Brissett's there, that could be the case, because he's got Amari Cooper, who obviously has been doing really well, and now David Njoku, who got a big chunk of targets and put up a big game. So he proved himself reliable for a backup quarterback. We'll have to see how that continues out. At the tight end position, Mike Gesicki. Are we ready to just get rid of Mike Gesicki yet? Because this is not 2 straight weeks, but 2 out of the last 3 weeks, he has 1 point. 1.6 points, only had a catch for 6 yards and only 1 target as well. So it wasn't even like, the silver lining is he had 6 targets. He had 1 target, caught it once for 6 yards. Bad game, especially if you started him like I did. Then you had Darren Waller. What's going on in Las Vegas where Mac Hollins gets 8 catches, but the Walrus, the biggest target from the last, 2-3 years for Vegas, only has 3 catches for 22 yards and 5.2 fantasy points. It's a tough pill to swallow, but that's what it is. Now let's real quick get into buying in and selling these fantasy players, whether or not you want to get with them for the rest of the year. We'll start with Tua Tagovailoa. He's averaging 26.8 fantasy points, has 8 touchdowns and 2 interceptions through the first 3 weeks, and has a 70% completion percentage. So that's a great percentage. Looking at fantasy wide receivers for him as well, is if he's throwing him the ball, it's going to be accurate, going to get to him. So I am buying into Tua for the rest of the year. And it's a fairly favorable schedule. He's got Cincinnati, the Jets, Minnesota, Pittsburgh, which might be a tough matchup, Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland. So a lot of really favorable matchups as well throughout the next stretch of games. Could be seeing a lot of fantasy points going Tua's way. Who am I selling at the quarterback position? How about Matt Stafford? I'm getting tired of it. He's averaging 13.3 fantasy points. He's got more interceptions than touchdowns, only 4 touchdowns with 5 interceptions. And he only has 1 game over 15 points, and that wasn't even a huge game. It was 18.8 points. It's in an offense that he should be thriving in. He did last year. Wasn't necessarily a fantasy star, but he was at least in the top 8, I think. So it's really tough, and he's got a pretty tough schedule coming up with San Francisco, Dallas, which is a good defense. Carolina might be a better game for him, but then he's got San Francisco again, Tampa Bay, Arizona. Just not good. And I think he played Arizona already, only got 10.1. So not expecting much out of him, at least for these next stretch of games. And that's a little too late. That's going to put you out of fantasy if you keep him in and he continues to get just 10 points. At the running back position, let's buy in to James Robinson. He has, 15 plus carries in 2 games and over 50 rushing yards and has 100-yard rushing game. That's huge. He's outpacing the backfield in Travis Etienne. He's outproducing what you thought he would anyway. But if you've been a James Robinson believer, he's doing exactly what you would have expected. He has a touchdown every game. He had 2 in week 1. And he's had 15 or more fantasy points a game. You can't ask for much more out of a running back than 15 points as the floor. So I'm buying in. Again, we talked about this Jags offense apparently being pretty good. So give me James Robinson for the rest of the season and I'll be happy. Let's sell on Joe Mixon. He's having a steady decline in all of these categories. Carries, yards, receptions, fantasy points. In the last 2 weeks, he scored under 15. 15's a pretty solid number for your running back. It's not huge boom games. It's not a bust, but 15 is a tough number to be below and compete with other teams that have running backs who can get up to 20. He only has 3.7 yards a touch, and he has no touchdowns so far this year. This Bengals offense is struggling. Their offensive line is not very good, which they can't run block either. So I'm selling on Joe Mixon. He's maybe somebody you can buy back into later on, but now he has this ankle injury that, if re-aggravated, could, sideline him as well. So I'm out on Joe Mixon. Who are we buying into at the wide receiver position? How about Chris Olave? He has 13 targets in the last 2 games, as in 13 targets in week 2, 13 targets in week 3. he turned those 13 targets into 100 yards last week and is averaging 14.6 fantasy points. He had 23.7 last week, I believe it was. So that's huge. He's getting a lot of targets. If you look at his air yards, before last week, he had like 300 air yards, which isn't saying he has 300 receiving yards. It means he's targeted for 300 and some odd air yards. That's crazy. Big time plays. You got a guy like Jameis who likes to throw deep balls, and you have a guy like Chris Olave who at Ohio State, that was his MO. Trying to translate it here, and 13 targets. Imagine if 2 of those connect. Just 2 big targets. That'll put you at 20 points immediately, even into the 30-point range because it's 2 touchdowns, 2 catches, maybe 80 yards. That's huge. And then tack on the rest of those. I'm buying into Chris Olave this year. Who am I selling at the wide receiver position? Brandon Cooks. Have him on literally every fantasy team, and I want to sell him off every fantasy team. He has 29 targets this year, which seems pretty good. That's like 10 targets a game. He's only turned it into 13 receptions, no touchdowns, and is declining in every category from the start of the year. He's been under 10 points the last 2 weeks and under 5 receptions in the last 2 weeks. So I don't know what else you need to see from him. This Houston offense is trying to get him the ball. He just can't do it. They're not trying to get him the ball enough, not giving him good targets. I'm just out on it, and I'm tired of it. Been in my lineup for 3 weeks, and there's a reason that I am 1-8 in all 3 leagues. Who am I buying into at the tight end position? Well, it's a pretty shitty position, but how about we buy into Tyler Conklin? 11.6 fantasy points is his average, 11.6 was his first week total. 10 was his second week total, and 16.4 was his total last week. Steady increase, over 10, and honestly, if you're getting over 10 in your tight end position, you can take that. And he has 7 or more targets in every game. He has more than 5 receptions in 2 of those games, and last week he had 8 targets and caught every single one of them. So he went 8 for 8, and that attributed to his 16 points. Possibility of Zach Wilson coming back this week. Zach Wilson, we assume, is a better quarterback than Joe Flacco, so that will push everybody's stock up, including Tyler Conklin. So let's buy into him until he gives us a reason not to. And then at the tight end position, we're selling Mike Gesicki. I already kind of talked about it last week. Talked about it earlier in the show. 2 of the last 3 weeks, he scored 1 point. He has 6 targets overall throughout 3 games and averages less than 10 yards per reception. Only has 1 touchdown, and that was the only thing that made his week 2 relevant instead of having 1 point again. So I'm getting rid of Mike Gesicki. Don't like him. Get him out of here. Put in Tyler Conklin. Now let's get to the love-hate to finish out the show. Who do I love this week at the quarterback position? I love Josh Allen against Baltimore. He is projected 25.1 fantasy points. Baltimore, 32nd against the pass. So have yourself a field day. Josh Allen, he averages 29.3 fantasy points a game. He's at 300 or more yards passing every single game, and he's had multiple touchdowns in every single week. Going against a soft pass defense, averaging 29.3 fantasy points, 300 passing yards, and more than 1 touchdown. Give that to me all day. I know it's predictable, but let's take it. Now let's go unpredictable for my other quarterback love, and that is going to be Geno Smith against Detroit. He's projected 17.5. Detroit, on average this year so far, have given up 23.6 fantasy points to quarterbacks. They gave up the quarterback 4. The Lions gave up the quarterback 4, the quarterback 5, and the quarterback 9 in the last 3 weeks. So if the baseline is top 10 for Geno Smith, Let's take that this week. Geno's only averaging 14.1, but he's coming off of his first 300-yard game. Now going up against Detroit, who's giving up top 10 quarterbacks left and right. I think Geno Smith is going to have a pretty good week. Who do I hate at the quarterback position? Start with Carson Wentz going up against Dallas. He's projected 16.2, but Dallas gives up only an average of 13.56 to quarterbacks. It's going to be a close game. Every Dallas game so far has been, and that's all they give up. Normally in a close game, you'd expect, okay, they're going to have to be throwing. Carson Wentz is going to have to be throwing. Other quarterbacks have to do that as well. Nobody's really scored all that much. And Carson Wentz is coming off of an 8-point performance. I don't think this is the bounce back game for him. So I don't like Carson Wentz this week, especially against a Dallas defense that isn't the best, but it's still pretty solid, and it's hard for fantasy quarterbacks thus far this season to play against them. Then I also hate Matt Stafford. I'm just going to continue to poop on Matt Stafford. I had him in the villains. I'm selling him, and now I hate him. Going up against San Francisco, projected 16.3. San Francisco so far, this is a number that's a bit skewed because they had the slop game in week 1. The Broncos broken offense in week 2. But they only give up an average of 9.6 fantasy points to quarterbacks so far. Stafford's average is 12.3, and his best performance was only 18.8. He doesn't have a 300-yard game. He has 2 games under 15 points, and he didn't have a touchdown last week. No thank you. Not taking him this week. I'll go find anything else. Let's go to the running back position. This one is also predictable, but I love Jonathan Taylor going up against Tennessee. 21.2 fantasy points. Tennessee is 29th against the run, and they gave up a 33-point performance in week 1, which turned out to be the running back 1 performance. So, yes, please give me Jonathan Taylor having a running back 1 performance this week. Also in week 1, Jonathan Taylor had 27.5 fantasy points, had only 10 touches in week 2, which caused him to not have a great game. But then he had 24 touches in week 3, which is exactly what he should be getting. Over 20 touches. Hopefully, 5 of those are receptions at least. And against a weak run defense with Tennessee, I like Jonathan Taylor this week. And then let's take Jamal Williams as our love running back number 2. Going up against Seattle, he's projected 14.2. Seattle gives up 18.1 fantasy points to the running back 1 position on every team. And they gave up 22.5 points last week. No Swift this week for Williams. And he had 24.5 last week with a limited Swift. He also had, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 in week 1 with Swift. He's averaging 15.9. I see a 20-point game coming out of him. Hopefully more. Get a couple of touchdowns in there as well. But I love Jamal Williams this week. Who do I hate at the running back position? Josh Jacobs against Denver. He's projected 13.2, but Denver, to the running back 1 position, has only allowed 9.6 fantasy points on average. And they are 6th, sixth against the run. So that's a tough defense to get by at all. Jacobs, last 2 games, or not last 2 games, but 2 games so far this season, under 10 points, 1 game of 14. So didn't even break that 15-point threshold that I like for running backs. And he's only averaging 10.7. Let's sell him this week. And I think it's going to be a tough defensive game for both of these offenses, but Josh Jacobs in particular. And then how about Clyde Edwards-Helaire? Let's hate him this week. He's going up against Tampa Bay. He's projected 11.9, but Tampa Bay only gives an average of 5.9 fantasy points. And they haven't played slouch running backs. So that's really tough. Tampa Bay's 5th against the run. And the highest fantasy finish they've given to a running back is 6.1 fantasy points. I don't want double digits for my running backs ever. This is a week where it looks like that's going to happen. So I'm going to hate on Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I loved on him last week, but I don't like this matchup. Wide receiver position, Amari Cooper against Atlanta. He's projected 14.3. Atlanta gives up an average of 23.9 to the top receiver for other teams. And Atlanta has given up 27.7. Okay, let me start over. They gave up a 22.7 week and a 31.8 fantasy point week in the first 3 weeks. So those are big games. Cooper averages 17.5 fantasy points, and he's had back-to-back 20-point performances of 25.1 and 23.1. Seems pretty on line for the 23.9 that Atlanta gives up. So I love Cooper this week. Let's take him. And then just talked about him in the bye category. Let's take Chris Olave against Minnesota. Minnesota is 29th against the pass, and back-to-back weeks with 13 targets, like I said again. And he had 23.5 fantasy points last week. So let's take him again. Let's buy him for the whole season, and let's start it this. Well, it started last week. Let's continue it this week. Receivers that I hate, Curtis Samuel going against Dallas. He's projected 14.4. And again, Dallas is 4th against the pass. I don't like Carson Wentz this game. I really hope Curtis Samuel doesn't also suffer, but I don't think it's going to be a great passing game for Washington. So just don't give me Curtis Samuel this week. Then Mike Williams against Houston. He's projected 12.6. And he only averages 12.3, and all of this mostly without Keenan Allen. So, and Allen could be back this week. So it's just, he only had 1 catch last week. It was for a touchdown. That's the only thing that saved him. Didn't even get him to double digits. So, I don't know what's going on. I don't know why they won't throw the ball to Mike Williams. I don't know how he's not more involved. But I don't like him this week, especially if Keenan Allen is also back. Then at the tight end position, let's take Zach Ertz against Carolina. He's projected 10.5. He's a consistent tight end, averaging 12.5. And the last 2 weeks, he's had 10 targets and been the tight end 4. So, yeah, we'll take a top 5 tight end every single day if we can. And then, again, Tyler Conklin. He's going up against Pittsburgh, projected 8.7. He's currently the tight end 3. No finishes under 10 points, and has 24 targets so far this season. And again, if Zach Wilson is back, you just have to think that helps the entire offense. So I like it this week. Who do I hate this week for the tight end position? Darren Waller going against Denver, projected 11.2. Only had 5.2 last week against Tennessee, and only has 1 game so far with 5 catches or more. That's not the Darren Waller we're used to. Going up against Denver, who's a pretty good defense. I don't like it this week. I think it's mostly going to be Devontae Adams. I mean, if they want to beat Denver, they're going to have to throw the ball a lot. And Darren Waller should be on that reception list, but I just don't see it being big this week. And then I don't really like Tyler Higbee this week going up against San Francisco. Projected 10.9. San Francisco, they give out crumbs to tight ends. 0 in week 1. 2 in week 2, and 2.2 in week 3. So that's going to be tough to get over. Higbee, he averages 11, but doesn't have any games with 15 or more, and he only had 10.1 in week 3, which is good. We'll take that. This week, I just don't like the matchup. It's going to be tough. But that is it for today. It ran a little long, to be honest, probably because of my little rant in the beginning. But thanks for watching, guys. If you are watching the stream, again, thank you. Appreciate it. And if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget, at 9 o'clock on Tuesdays and Thursdays, right here on Twitch, can watch it live, get involved in the chat. Get a little conversation going. That would be nice. If you want to listen, you can obviously listen over here on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Anchor, wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also listen if you don't have the ability to watch or don't want to watch, you just want to listen. That is available as well. Tune in tomorrow for Lucky Bets. It'll probably be a little later. Gonna have to record in the afternoon, so don't look for it immediately in the morning. Look for it a little later. Dylan Corbett will join the show. And then tune in Thursday here on Twitch at 9 o'clock for the Game Day show. But make sure to give a like, a comment, subscribe, follow, all those deals. If you want to follow, the link is in my page description. It's in my YouTube page description. You can find all of those. But again, I don't know if I'm very new to Twitch, so I don't know if you can follow or like or whatever here, but do all those things if you can. And then tune in tomorrow, tune in Thursday. But that is it for today, guys. Appreciate you tuning in. We will see you next time, which is tomorrow.